Hi everyone, today I wanted to get straight into talking about the Symmetrical Diminished scale. I'm going to break it apart and talk about how this scale is commonly thought of within the context of improvising, so that we know where and how we can use it, or most importantly, how it functions. We're going to cover all the theory so that you have a complete understanding of what you can do with this concept, but I'm also going to analyze a few of my favorite phrases or diminished lines so that we can use this as a study for constructing our own ideas. So quickly before we continue, my name is Robbie Barnby. This channel is where I share the musical concepts I've developed and studied over the years that have helped improve me as a musician. My videos are geared towards anyone wanting to improve their ability to improvise, so if you're new here, consider subscribing so that you can keep up to date with all the content and the deep dives into cool concepts. With that said, let's get straight into the theory of this one. The Symmetrical Diminished is an 8-note scale, and the name which is more commonly used for it is called the Whole Half Diminished. We like this name because it describes the intervallic structure or formula of the scale. The word whole meaning whole step or tone, and the word half meaning half step or semitone. So if we start on the note C and construct the scale using the pattern of a recurring whole step and then half step, we get C, D, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, A, and B. That's our 8-note scale, or C whole half diminished. Notice how the intervallic structure goes whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, and then a half step, which brings us back to the root. It's important to mention that the reason this scale falls under the category of being one of the symmetrical scales is because of its repeated pattern. We have a whole step and a half step, which is acting as one complete cell. This cell then moves in minor thirds, giving us the rest of the notes within this whole half diminished. So the intervals which we get is the root, a major second, a minor third, perfect fourth, a flat fifth, a flat sixth, a major sixth, and a major seventh. Okay, so as I've just mentioned the moving in minor thirds thing, before we go further, I want to quickly review what the diminished chord, or rather what the fully diminished seventh chord is. Now this may be another foundation which you'll probably already know quite well, but I think it's worth covering. What we know as the fully diminished, or the diminished 7, is a chord which is constructed of recurring minor third intervals. So in C, we would get C, E flat, G flat, and A, which is the root, minor third, flat 5, and because this is a 7th chord, a double flat 7. So this chord is another symmetrical construction because there's no deviation of the intervallic pattern. It's all just recurring minor thirds. Because of this, every diminished chord a minor third apart share the same notes and are just inversions of each other. So C diminished, E flat diminished, G flat, and A diminished are all the same or belong to the same diminished family. And because there are 4 diminished chords which belong to the same family, and we only have 12 chromatic notes or 12 possible roots for a chord, well, 4 goes into 12 3 times, so this means that there are only 3 existing diminished chords or families, as the rest are just inversions of either one of them. So back to our whole half scale. This minor third family concept of course applies to our symmetrical scale as well. So the C whole half diminished shares the same notes as an E flat, G flat, and A whole half diminished, and therefore there are only 3 different symmetrical diminished scales which exist. Okay, so now that we know about the diminished 7th chord, there is another way to view the construction of this symmetrical scale. I actually mentioned this in my Barry Harris 6th diminished video, but basically, when harmonizing any 8-note scale by stacking it in thirds, we'll only ever get 2 4-note chords which move through their inversions. So you could view the C whole half diminished scale as just being constructed by a C diminished 7th and a D diminished 7th, as the notes from these 2 chords, when put together, give us the complete scale. So we'll talk about some good fingerings in a minute, but for now, here's just the notes of the scale played on one string. And here it is harmonized in drop 2 voicings. Before we talk about the function of this scale and where or how we use it, we need to get into the other mode which this scale gives us. So, because of the nature of this scale being symmetrical, we only get one other mode which is built from treating either one of the D diminished chord tones as the root. So either the 2nd, 4th, flat 6th, or major 7th of the scale. Now the name we call this new scale or mode is the Half Whole Diminished, because again, this name describes the intervallic formula. So our cell now goes half step and then whole step, which again moves in minor thirds. So if we view this scale from D being the root, so D half whole diminished, Intervallically, we get the root, flat 2 or flat 9, a sharp 9, a major 3rd, a flat 5 and a perfect 5th, a major 6th and a flat 7. And of course, remember, D half whole will share the same notes as F, A flat and B half whole, as they come from the same family a minor third apart. Now, this scale is still constructed from 2 different diminished chords, so nothing's changed there. However, within this half whole scale or mode, we also find a dominant chord. So if we view this as a dominant sound or scale or chord, we get a D13 with a flat 9, sharp 9 and sharp 11 or flat 5. I say sharp 11 because we also have a natural 5th in the scale. But anyway, we can already see that this has some great extensions for a unique dominant color with tension options. So let's play our harmonized C whole half diminished again. But this time, instead of playing D diminished, let's make every other chord a dominant. Let's do a dominant sharp 9 voicing. To make this sound even more modern, we could change the C diminished 7 to a C diminished major 7. So instead of the root, flat 3rd, flat 5 and 6th or double flat 7, the double flat 7 becomes a major 7 instead. This works because a major 7 is also found within our C whole half diminished scale. However, by harmonizing both chords in this way of one being a dominant and one being a diminished with a major 7 instead, well, these chords are no longer symmetrical compared to when we harmonized the scale with the original fully diminished 7 chords. I'll mention the effect that has and what we can do with this in a minute. Okay, so before we get into some lines, let's quickly talk about the functions for these two scales. I've kind of gone into it, but just to be clear, we use the whole half diminished as a scale option for diminished chords, such as a diminished 7th or a diminished major 7th, and we use the half whole as a tension option for dominants, which are usually functioning as a resolving 5 chord, but also in a sort of modal way when a dominant is functioning more as a 1 chord. So the whole half is our parent scale, and as I said before, the half whole is its only other mode. However, we should really consider both of them as being parent scales in their own right, as they are really just the same as each other and function the same because of the relationship between dominant and diminished chords. It just depends how you prefer to visualize the scale or the harmony. What I mean by this is that we often use diminished chords for tension or movement in the same way we would use a dominant 5 chord. Let's take G7. It's really common to build a fully diminished chord off of the 3rd of a dominant, as that gives us a dominant flat 9. So B diminished over G is G7 flat 9. And so it functions the same. It's just a really common 5 chord tension which wants to resolve to some kind of C chord. And remember, diminished chords a minor third apart are all just inversions of one another, and therefore D diminished, F and A flat diminished are also G7 flat 9. It works the other way too. These diminished chords are also B flat 7 flat 9, D flat 7 flat 9 and E7 flat 9, because they're all, of course, a minor third apart too. As you can see, this means we can build a diminished 7th chord off of any chord tone of a dominant flat 9, so either the flat 9, 3rd, 5th or flat 7th. So we're now starting to see this relationship between diminished and dominant chords, and we can also look at it like this. B diminished is a diminished chord, so we would use the B whole half diminished scale. G7 is a dominant chord, so we would use the G half whole diminished scale. Well, B whole half and G half whole is the exact same scale. This is why both the whole half and half whole are really just functioning the same, it's just a different way to visualize it. Now G7 flat 9 is of course a great dominant tension option, and moving the related diminished voicing around in minor thirds does give us its inversions. However, a G7 flat 9 chord doesn't contain enough information or solely specify this unique symmetrical diminished sound because there are other dominant scales that have a diminished in them too. Therefore, the dominant flat 9 is also found within other modes, like the Phrygian dominant from harmonic minor, for example. So instead of the fully diminished, let's use that non-symmetrical diminished voicing from earlier to see what we get. Let's change B diminished 7 to a B diminished major 7. Over G, this is now functioning as a G7 sharp 9 instead of flat 9. So our chord tones are the 3rd, 5th, flat 7, and sharp 9. Now in order to generate unique chords from the G half whole or B whole half soundscape, what's cool is using this diminished major 7 structure on different dominant flat 9 chord tones, basically moving this voicing in minor thirds. Because this B diminished major 7 chord is no longer symmetrical, it will give us different G7 tensions when moving in minor thirds, and therefore a lot of these voicings will only relate to or only be found within the unique sound of the symmetrical diminished. So we're no longer just getting the inversions of G7 flat 9, but instead a series of different scale or chord tones found within the G half whole diminished scale. This is now really bringing out the sound or colour of the scale option. It's also worth discovering the actual inversions of a diminished major 7 too. There's a couple easy ways you can work this out. First, you could just take each fully diminished inversion and find where the double flat 7 is, and then move it up a tone or 2 frets to change it into a major 7. So we've already done with the first one. Here's the double flat 7. If we move it up a tone, let's do that with the others. So we get this. Now we can of course take any one of these and move them in minor thirds, as we'll still just get different sounds found within the symmetrical diminished scale. So we of course want to do this for D, F and A flat diminished major 7 too. So for D diminished, we just move the 7th again. And this is all still just over G7. Another easy way to discover all the diminished major 7 inversions for each related diminished chord is by just dealing with one inversion and then in turn move each note up a tone. For example, here's D diminished. If we move the top note up a tone, we get A flat diminished major 7 in second inversion. If instead we move the next one, well, we've got D diminished major 7 in root position. The next note gives us B diminished major 7 in first inversion. And then finally we've got F diminished major 7 in third inversion. We then do this for each fully diminished inversion so that we discover them all. And remember, we can do this for any kind of drop voicing and on any string set. All of these cool voicings can be used for either a diminished chord or a dominant chord when wanting to impose this symmetrical diminished sound over them. Spend some time discovering this because it's really liberating to see the relationships between all these diminished and dominant chords a minor third apart, because we then realize we can even just take any suitable dominant voicing found within the half whole scale and move it in minor thirds too. Here's a common G13. If we move it in minor thirds, we of course get B flat 13, D flat 13 and E 13. But if we get rid of each bass note and just visualize each voicing over a G, well, we get all of these really modern G half whole diminished sounds. Now, not every diminished chord in a song will be functioning as a dominant 5 chord, but instead maybe a diminished that creates movement in a different way. You might also be confronted by playing over a diminished in more of a modal context too. However, you'll know that you can, as an option, just tackle it with a whole half diminished scale built from the root of the diminished chord you come across. example of having to deal with the typical flat 3 diminished, which is a really common harmonic function. The flat 3 diminished often resolves to the 2 chord, like in that previous example, but you also often see it resolving to the 1 chord, such as in a blues, when we move from the dominant 4 and then play the sharp 4 diminished to get back to the 1. Well, this sharp 4 diminished is flat 3 diminished, or vice versa, as they're just inversions of each other. It's also the same as the 1 diminished, which resolves to the 1 chord. This is definitely something we see in so many songs. I should mention that there are also other parent scales which contain fully diminished chords, and therefore there are other modes or scales which can be used to bring out a different sound over the diminished, such as the altered double flat 7 or altered diminished, and also the Locrian diminished. These are actually modes which come from the harmonic minor and harmonic major parent scales, and they go back further to earlier eras of classical music and are probably closer to being the origin of finding these functioning diminished chords. Whereas this symmetrical scale concept is a much more modern sound or idea. Now, these other diminished sounds are not our focus here, but I'll definitely get into those parent scales in another video. Another thing which is worth being aware of when using the whole half diminished scale is that we sometimes need to be careful how we phrase with it. Remember, the notes of a C whole half diminished scale is constructed of a C diminished 7 and a B diminished 7 put together. So two of the same chord qualities a half step apart. So when ascending, we can really just see this scale as a C fully diminished chord, or arpeggio, which has chromatic approach notes before each chord tone. As we know, this is a really common way to use chromatics within the context of jazz line building. So this scale is doing a really great job of outlining the C diminished chord. Now, of course, these chromatic approach notes are diatonic to the whole half scale, but our ears aren't really hearing it as a scale, but instead as this common chromatic technique of approaching every chord tone with a chromatic from below. This becomes even more apparent when we play the scale descending. Suddenly, this doesn't really sound great because it's no longer approaching the C diminished chord tones with chromatics, but instead with whole tones. And this doesn't really function in a resolving way to our ears. This is where we need to be careful in terms of phrasing. So really, when descending, it's kind of better to play it like this. This way, we're still approaching each chord tone with a chromatic from below, or a diatonic chromatic from below, while we descend through the global sound of this scale. Okay, so for the rest of the examples, we're going to stick to viewing this symmetrical scale from the perspective of the half whole diminished. For me, I tend to more often view the half whole as being the parent scale, or my point of reference on the fretboard. I do think this is quite common, as it's often first introduced to us as a sound for dominant tension, so I think we end up feeling more comfortable viewing it this way. But, it doesn't really matter, because we know that we can still apply this to a diminished chord which does or doesn't function as a dominant, regardless of how we visualize it. So let's try and apply these ideas to some functioning harmony. Let's take a 1-6-2-5 in the key of C, as this is one of the most used progressions. So diatonically, we get C major, A minor, D minor, and G7. Now I'm going to assume you understand the concept of a secondary dominant, and that 6-2-5-1 is really just a series of backcycling chords. As the 6 is the 5 of the 2 is the 5 of the 5, and the 5 is, of course, the 5 of the 1. So the first thing we do is make the 6 and the 2 a dominant in order for them to be secondary dominants which want to move or resolve. So we now have C major, A7, D7, and G7. And we now have the possibility to increase the desire for each dominant to want to resolve by adding tension with a dominant color or scale option. Of course, we're going to be using the half whole for each of them. So starting with A7, let's use our diminished major 7 voicing. Remember, we can build this chord off of any of the chord tones of an A7 flat 9, so either the 3rd, the 5th, the flat 7th, or the flat 9th. And this is all just giving us different extensions or sounds found within a half whole diminished. Let's put it on our flat 7 as our starting point, so that's going to be G diminished major 7 over A. So now moving to D7, we have the same choices of where we can build the voicing, but always remember that voice leading is normally always something we want to do as much as possible. So if we build the diminished major 7 off of the 3rd of the D7, so on F sharp, well, we get perfect voice leading. Moving the voicing down to F, it's now built from the flat 7 again, but for G7. which then wants to resolve to some kind of C major. In this case, I'm doing E minor 11 over C, which gives us a sort of C major 13 sound. So together. It's also nice to do a sort of sidestep thing for the last chord before resolving to C. So. Let's try the same thing, but from a different starting point. Let's start with the diminished major 7 on the 5th of the A7 this time. This then moves to the flat 9 of the D7, then to the 5th of the G7 again, to C. Another one, how about off the 3rd of the A7? Now it's going to move to the flat 7 of the D, to the G, to C. So we've gone from this to this. I think I know which one I prefer. Alright, there's one more bit of theory which I want to get into before we start learning some phrases and analysing some line ideas. I want to talk about the basic triads which are found within this scale and what we can do with them. So let's take a G half whole diminished scale and look at what triads we get just from the root note G. We actually get a G major, a G minor, and a G diminished triad. So, this is already pretty unique and gives us a lot to play around with. And remember, this scale is symmetrical, so we also get these same triad types a minor third apart as well. So we get G major, B flat major, D flat major, and E major. I can't help it, that sound always reminds me of the... Anyway, back on topic, we also have a G minor, B flat minor, D flat minor, and E minor. And finally, G diminished, B flat diminished, D flat diminished, and E diminished. If we look at what triads we get for those notes in between, which you could view as our starting notes for A flat whole half diminished, well, we only get a diminished triad. So we'd have an A flat diminished. But this can, of course, as well move in minor thirds, which harmonizes the rest of those in between notes as their only option as well. So still in G half whole, which is the same as A flat whole half, we get A flat diminished, B diminished, D diminished, and F diminished. Now, this makes sense because these root notes are the chord tones of a G7 flat 9. And we've already said that we can play a diminished built from any of these chord tones in order to bring out a G dominant sound. In this case, we're just building a diminished triad instead of a 4-note fully diminished or a diminished major 7. Okay, so a cool thing to do is harmonize each note of the scale by taking one of these starting triads and moving it through the scale. Or in other words, moving each note of the triad to the next note of the scale. Let's take the G major triad first. If we start on this triad and move each note up to the next degree of the scale, we get a D flat minor triad. Move each note up again and we get a B flat major triad, the next major triad a minor third apart from our starting G triad. We then get an E minor triad, which is a minor third up from our previous D flat minor triad. So this continues in this way, and so you could see this as a cell of two triads which alternate between both the major and minor triads found within the scale. As you can hear, this is really clearly bringing out the sound of this half whole diminished scale. Let's now use the G minor triad as our starting point. The next triad we'd get would be an E major triad. This is now our cell which moves in minor thirds and harmonizes each note of the scale perfectly, but just this time it starts with the minor triad first and then goes to the major. Finally, if we do this starting on a G diminished triad, then as we already know, each note of the scale gets harmonized as a diminished while we move through. You could also explore by starting on the different inversions of the starting triad too. And I should also say that there are of course more exotic triads which can be found or built from each degree of the scale. However, I won't get into those now, but I will make sure to include them in the PDF material for this video. That being said, you'll get great sounds by using just these basic major and minor triads for both lines and pattern ideas, but also for interesting chord voicings. For example, you can voice any of these triads over a G7 and you'll get great tensions from the half whole diminished flavour. Obviously G over G7 isn't that interesting, but let's work backwards and try E over G7. So here's our E major triad on top of the root and the flat 7 over G7. This gives us a G13 flat 9, and we can of course voice it in different ways. We can specifically explore the different inversions of an E triad as well. And we could even make this major triad a spread triad, still over G7. Remember, this G13 flat 9 is a dominant tension, so it can, of course, resolve to a C. Let's try the D flat major triad over G7. So this is just another great colour from G half whole diminished, which spells out a G7 flat 9 with a flat 5 or sharp 11. Let's see what the B flat triad gives us. So over G7. So this gives us a G7 with a sharp 9. Remember, we can also try the minor triads too. So B flat minor over G. D flat minor. So using any of these available triads just gives us more colours and variations of the possible extensions. It's worth spotting that the minor triads are also just the relative minors of the major triads. We can also generate interesting voicings by constructing any diatonic intervallic structure and treating it as the starting voicing, which then moves through the scale. For example, we could build a voicing from the 7th with a construction of a 5th, next diatonic scale degree, and then another 5th. In this case, I'm making the 5th sharp 5s, but that's still diatonic to the scale. This is actually a construction I love doing for all kinds of scales and various kinds of harmony. For example, here's G Lydian, start on G, then 5th, another 5th, next scale degree, 5th, 5th. So really cool. I'll definitely get deeper into this pattern and some more ideas like this in another video. Anyway, back to this G half whole voicing. We can also see it as just taking a normal fully diminished chord, but we've shifted 2 of the voices up to the next scale degree. This is then what we're using or treating as our starting chord. If we move this through the scale now, we get this. So for some of these voicings, it would be a little weird and confusing to give names to, so it's better to just think of this as a shape which comes from and brings out the sound of the half whole diminished scale. Anyway, that's enough heavy theory. Let's now use this stuff for some lines and patterns which will help get this sound into our language. Let's visualize all these ideas in C again, so C half whole diminished, and let's first quickly cover a couple good fingerings for the scale. Okay, so we definitely want to know how to play the scale in position. Here's how I like to play it ascending. For the descending, I like to play 4 notes on the A string and 2 on the low E, as opposed to 3 notes on both, like when I ascended. So 4 notes, 2. I should also say that when beginning the scale on the root, I prefer to start with an upstroke when ascending, and therefore the first note tends to start on an upbeat. This is sort of related to the whole half phrasing thing I mentioned earlier, because we're really just doing a chromatic approach into every chord tone of a D flat diminished chord, but over C7. For descending, it feels fine to start with the downstroke on the downbeat. Also, without getting into too much detail, we definitely want to practice this scale position in all the diatonic interval sets that are available to us. For example, here it is quickly just in thirds. These are all written out on the PDF too. Triads in position are also really good to do. great thing about learning all of this stuff in position is that the shape will look the exact same every minor third apart. This makes it really easy to apply all over the neck. And remember, this shape will be shared across all the other root notes or keys which belong to the same diminished family. So, G flat A or E flat half whole diminished is all the same shape. And I know I keep saying this, but even though I'm thinking C half whole diminished, this is the same shape I'd use for D flat whole half. So if I wanted to play C whole half for a C diminished 7 or C diminished major 7 sound, I would personally probably think about the shape for B half whole. So, as well as learning it in position, you'll also find that learning the scale in more of a linear, symmetrical way across the neck will also come in handy. For this, it's basically just a 4-note per string pattern, and the only thing that we have to be mindful of is switching from the G string to the B string, as the standard guitar tuning tends to stunt us a little bit there. So. Okay, so that's the fingerings. Let's get into the first pattern with the triad idea, which blends both the major and minor triad found on the same root. Here's the idea. So I'm starting on the E flat major triad and I play the 3rd, 5th and root. But then on top I put the minor 3rd. So you could see this as a blend of both an E flat major triad and an E flat minor triad. Here's our E flat major and here's our E flat minor. I then do the same thing for the A triad. Here's A major, and here's A minor. And then the same for the G flat, and then same for the C triad. A nicer way to finger it might be something like this. There's something else that's cool which is happening in this pattern, and it's the order of the root movement. For example, we could just play each triad idea in minor thirds, so E flat to G flat to A to C. But to me, this sounds really predictable and obvious. What I tend to prefer, and what's going on in this pattern, is that we're actually moving in tritones and then a minor third. So you could see it as if we've got two roots, a tritone apart, and these two roots are acting as one cell which then moves in minor thirds. So we had E flat to A, which then moves up a minor third to G flat to C. And if we wanted to continue this, it would be A to E flat and then C to G flat. This is much more of an interesting or disguised pattern, and in fact it's cool just moving the pattern in tritones. For example, here's the same triad idea but descending and only using two of the roots which are a tritone apart, so A and E flat. So here's the triad idea for A, E flat, A, E flat. Okay, for our next idea, let's use a 2-note cell pattern based on fourths. So we can visualize the pattern like this. The starting notes for each cell make up a fully diminished arpeggio. So this can of course be built from either the 5th, flat 7th, 3rd or the flat 9th on either of the dominants from the diminished family. So C7, E flat 7, G flat 7 or A7. We're thinking C7 here, so we're seeing this as starting from the 5th. But it really doesn't matter, as you could use this for an A7 line, but just starting from the flat 7th. Anyway, to complete this 2-note cell, the related interval which we're going to assign to each starting note is going to be a diatonic fourth. So this now uses all the notes of the scale, but just arranged in a really cool way. So the next thing to do with this idea would be to try the other variations. At the moment, I played up ascending, the word ascending meaning that we're ascending through the scale. The word up relates to each 2-note cell and means that we're playing the starting note before the related interval. For example, here's one cell, we play the starting note and then the related interval, and then we go to the next cell. We could do down ascending instead. So we're still ascending through the scale, but this time for each cell, we play the related interval before the starting notes. So down, but still ascending. We can then alternate them by doing up, down, ascending. This is probably one of my favorites for this pattern. Flip them around, so now we're doing down, up, ascending. This one doesn't feel quite as comfortable. We can of course do all these variations for descending too. Here's up, down, descending. So I'm still alternating between up and then down, but I'm now descending through the scale. Okay, next idea. Here's a must-know diminished pattern, which is probably most made famous by John Coltrane. So the way you could see this is as a sort of cell within a cell. We have a two-note cell, which then moves down a tritone to do the same thing. This is like our microcells, but we now treat this as one big four-note cell, which then moves down in minor thirds. So in position. We can then also extend this into a big six-note cell instead, which moves down in minor thirds. So 6 notes. This one actually really complements using the other symmetrical fingering from earlier. So it's only the B and G string where it gets a little bit awkward. Okay, let's try a diminished line which makes use of some chromatics. This is going to be a four-note cell, so if we think C7, we start on the sharp 9 and we do a chromatic approach down to the flat 9. We then jump up to the next diatonic note above, which is the 3rd, before landing on the root. When we land on this root, this is going to be the start of the pattern again, but just a minor third below. So our four-note cell is really this, which then moves down in minor thirds. The fingering I like for this is sort of based around that linear 4-note per string scale shape, which I showed earlier. So slowly. The last idea I'll show you is a great phrase used a lot in bebop. You hear guys like Sonny Stitt do this all the time. I like it because it complements using slurs and therefore gives you this really fluid sound. So thinking C7, it's a 4-note cell which goes root, flat 9, root, flat 7. And then this then just gets moved up or down in minor thirds. So you can slur the first 3 notes for that fluid sound, which means you'd only pick the 1st and 4th note of the 4-note cell. If you wanted a little bit more control, you could also pick the 2nd note and only slur into the 3rd note. So for the fingering, it actually works quite well to jump up or down in minor thirds or by 3 frets. I'm just changing strings in order to keep it in position as much as possible while maintaining the same finger shape for each cell. You could also apply this idea to our 4-note per string scale position for more of a symmetrical fingering. You'll now need to also use a slide as a part of the slur. I probably prefer the other way, but this fingering is very symmetrical to the point where you could even see it as a sort of 8-note cell which moves in tritones. Same thing, but just lines up nicely with the fingering. So those are some nice ideas to start off with. All of these lines can be used for either the diminished or dominants, which come from the same family. And, you know, as we're viewing these lines as a sort of C13 flat 9 tension, then of course they'll resolve really nicely to F major. But we could also see it as an A13 flat 9 resolving to D. How about G flat dominant resolving to B? Or E flat dominant resolving to A flat? I also want to mention that even just switching up your normal fully diminished arpeggios with diminished major 7/1s can really spice up your dominant lines. It's really common to use a diminished arpeggio on any chord tone of a dominant flat 9 chord, you know, stuff like this. There's a lot of good arpeggio shapes written out on the PDF, but these 2-note per string ones are quite popular. However, just using the fully diminished ones only give us one sound regardless of which dominant flat 9 chord tone you build it from, because of it being symmetrical. Whereas if we play around with the diminished major 7 arpeggios on each chord tone, then in the same way as it did for chords, but now for single note lines, it just brings out all these modern sounds from the half whole scale. You can find all the written out material and transcriptions of everything I played on my Patreon, and I've also written out extra phrases, patterns, chordal stuff, the triad concepts, and even some scale exercises / workouts for this symmetrical diminished scale. The PDFs for this video should give you all the material you need to really get into and master this very sophisticated sound. So thanks for watching and making it to the end. If you found the video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss out on any new posts. That's all from me. Happy practicing, and I'll see you in the next one.